All right, so now let's do completing the square process a couple more times. This will require some fractions. It's probably going to be as hard as it can possibly be. So it's good for you guys to kind of see that in action. So again, the first order of business is we need our lead coefficient to be 1. So I'm going to accomplish that by dividing both sides by 3. That will basically give us x squared minus 5x plus 2 equals 0. We're going to isolate the incomplete part by subtracting 2 from both sides. And now we're ready to go find that little piece of square that we need. So we usually take the lead coefficient of x and divide it by 2. That doesn't simplify anymore, so that's the size of our flap. To get the area I need to add, we're going to square that, and that gives us 25 over 4. So to complete this square, I need to add 25 over 4 to both sides. All right, now again, this number right there, the flap, if you would, that gives us the number we need to factor that trinomial on the left-hand side. On the other side, we'll need to find a common denominator, so multiply top and bottom by 4. So we'll end up with negative 8 plus 25 over 4. And so we have parentheses x minus 5 halves squared, and that looks like it's going to be 17 over 4. So we've completed the square, and so now we're ready to use the square root property, since that's what the completing the square process basically gives us. So taking the square root of both sides, don't forget your plus and minus. Let me bring that up to the top. We now have x minus 5 halves equals plus or minus. This breaks up, right? We have the square root of 17, and then the square root of 4 is 2. And so now adding 5 halves to both sides, right, we basically get x equals 5 halves plus or minus the square root of 17 over 2. Okay, and oftentimes we'll write this answer, since we're adding and subtracting, right, this is 5 plus or minus the square root of 17 all over 2. But please be aware there's actually 2 answers, right? So, I don't know, again, how the book usually wants you to write them with parentheses and not whatnot. But the 2 answers, right, one would be 5 plus the square root of 17 over 2. And the other one would be 5 minus the square root of 17 over 2. All right, so that wraps up. And by the way, you can keep your answer in that form when it comes to test time. So that's pretty complicated. There's some fractions involved. But again, if you just follow the process and watch your fraction math, you can do it. All right, so the next one, again, we need a lead coefficient of 1. So in this case, I'll divide both sides by 2. And that'll basically give us x squared, minus 1/2 x plus 1 equals 0. So we got a fraction to contend with. Subtract 1 from both sides to complete the square. And we got x squared minus 1/2 x equals negative 1. Okay, so we need to basically take the negative 1/2 and divide it by 2. Since we're dealing with a fraction, I'm going to write that division by 2 like that. The reason being is because we know that to divide fractions, we multiply by reciprocal. So we're going to get negative 1/4. So there's the size of the flap. Of course, to get the part that I need to add, we're going to square that, and that gives us 1/16. So that basically tells us to complete this square, right, I am basically going to add 1/16 to both sides. Okay, and again, the flap size gives us the power, if you would, the number we need to use to factor this trinomial. So that'll factor as x minus 1/4 squared. And over here, how about I write that as 16 over 16, and it looks like we end up with negative 15 over 16 on that side. Okay, again, we have the square root property in play, so plus and minus the square root. The square clears out over here. All right, and I don't need all that parentheses. Let me make that a little nicer. All right, so everything clears out here. So we have x minus 1/4. We have plus or minus. We have the square root of negative 15 upstairs. and the square root of 16 is 4 downstairs. Okay, and then we know that this, right, is I square root of 15, right? So at the moment, right, if we add 1/4 to both sides, right, here's what we get. So after all that simplification, we get x equals 1/4 plus or minus I square root of 15 all over 4, right? And again, since we're adding and subtracting, you could put these together. Oops, let me put them together, right? 1 plus or minus I square root of 15 all over 4. But again, remember there are two answers to this, and perhaps the book will want you to write them as individuals, right? So there's 1 plus I square root of 15 over 4, right? And there's 1 minus I square root of 15 over 4. All right, so there's our two answers. In this case, we have complex ones. So that's probably as complicated as completing the square is going to get, pushing fractions around. But as you can see, if you just remember your fraction rules, remember the process of completing the square, very, very doable. All right, so that wraps that up onto using this to find x-intercepts and other applications. Talk to you soon.